Stepmother married my father before he died. Now she wants the house, but has no idea that I bought the house and she has no rights to it. I'm not going to introduce myself, and I'll change the names of everyone in this story. It's not really important who I am. What matters is what happened. I just want to share this story with you, because sometimes it feels like it's the only thing keeping me from losing it. After my mom passed away, it was like a piece of my dad just vanished with her. He couldn't cope, plain and simple. Everything spiraled at once. He lost his job not long after her funeral, said he couldn't focus anymore, couldn't keep up with the demands. Then he lost the house too. It all just collapsed like some sick domino effect, one thing toppling after another. No backup plan, no family to lean on besides me. I remember the day he called me, voice shaky like I'd never heard before. My dad had always been strong, always the one who kept it together for us. But that day he sounded like he was just broken. "I don't know what to do, son," he said, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever heard. So I did what I had to do. I bought him a small house. It wasn't much, just a little place in an old, quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. It was somewhere he could be safe, where he could try to put the pieces back together. A place where he could just breathe again. He wasn't moving in alone, though. He had Buddy, my mom's dog, this scrappy little mutt who was more of a family member than a pet. Buddy was my mom's shadow when she was alive, and after she passed, he became that last thread to her memory. For the first few years, things were okay. Not perfect, but manageable. My dad started getting better, or at least I thought he was. The house became his sanctuary, a place where he could hide from the world, with Buddy right by his side, tail wagging like it was his mission in life to keep my dad going. I made it a point to visit every weekend, grill something in the backyard, drink a couple of beers while Buddy chased his tail around the lawn. It became our little routine, a way to keep some sense of normalcy in a life that had gone off the rails. But things never stay the same, do they? Things started changing when Linda came into my dad's life. She wasn't bad at first. In fact, when he first told me about her, I was happy for him. I mean, after losing my mom, I didn't think he'd ever open himself up to someone again. He'd been so closed off, like he'd built walls around himself that no one could get through. But Linda, she seemed to be breaking through those walls. I remember the first time I met her. We were grilling in the backyard like usual, and my dad invited her over for lunch. She showed up with this big smile, carrying a homemade pie like she was straight out of some 1950s sitcom. She was all polite, talking about how lucky she felt to have met my dad, and how she wanted him to be happy again. It all seemed genuine at the time. So, when he told me they were getting married a few months later, I didn't object. Honestly, I felt a bit of relief. Maybe this was the fresh start he needed. But then it started to get complicated. Not long after they got married, Linda's older daughter, Alice, moved into the house. I didn't think much of it at first. Alice was in her 20s, and I figured maybe she just needed a place to stay for a while. Then, a couple of months later, her younger daughter, Kate, moved in too. Now suddenly, this house I bought for my dad was filled with people I barely knew. It was like the place had gone from being his sanctuary to being a boarding house. At first, I kept my mouth shut. I told myself as long as Dad was happy, that was all that mattered. But, truth be told, I wasn't happy about it. Not at all. I'd show up for our usual weekend visits, and it didn't feel the same. The backyard barbecues turned into awkward affairs, with Linda and her daughters lounging around like they owned the place. Alice would sit there, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging me, while Kate would make these snide little comments, acting like she was some kind of princess and we were beneath her. And Linda? She would just laugh it off, acting like it was all normal. But the worst part, the part that really started to gnaw at me, was how my dad seemed to be fading into the background. He didn't speak up as much anymore. He'd sit quietly, letting Linda and her daughters dominate the conversation, nodding along to whatever they said like he didn't have a voice of his own anymore. It was subtle at first, but it became more obvious every time I visited. My dad wasn't the man I used to know. He wasn't the guy who'd grill burgers with me and laugh about old memories. He was just there. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was off. I just didn't realize how bad it would get. It didn't take long before things started spiraling. Linda and her daughters didn't just move in, they took over. I'm not sure when I started noticing it, but suddenly they were running everything. My dad wasn't making any decisions anymore. And if he did speak up, Linda or Alice would shoot him down real quick, like his opinion didn't matter. The house started to feel different too. I'd come over, and it didn't look or feel like the place I'd bought for my dad. Alice and Kate had decorated the place with their stuff. Cheap furniture, gaudy decorations, and clothes thrown everywhere. It felt more like their house than his. The walls that used to hold family photos now had their junk plastered all over them. Art prints and framed quotes about living your truth or some other bullshit. Even Buddy seemed out of place, lying in the corner like he didn't belong anymore. And speaking of Buddy, that's when things really took a turn. One day, during one of my weekend visits, Kate made a comment about how Buddy made her uncomfortable. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Buddy, who had been part of our family for years, was suddenly a problem because this spoiled brat didn't like dogs? At first, I thought maybe she was joking, but Linda didn't hesitate to back her up. Well, honey, if Kate doesn't feel comfortable, maybe we need to think about what's best for everyone, she said, all calm and collected, like she was just trying to help. I looked at my dad, expecting him to say something, to stand up for Buddy at least. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at the floor, not saying a word. It was like he was too tired to even try. That was it for me. I snapped. No way. Buddy's not going anywhere, I said, my voice louder than I intended. He's family. If anyone's uncomfortable, it's your problem. Linda gave me this fake smile, the kind that says, you don't know what you're talking about. She tried to calm me down, saying, we're just trying to make things work for everyone. You know how Kate feels, and your father. My father doesn't feel anything, does he? I interrupted, looking right at him. Dad? What do you think? He barely looked up, just mumbled, maybe it's for the best. I couldn't believe it. The man who'd loved that dog, who needed that dog after Mom died, was willing to give him up because they told him to? I wasn't about to let that happen. Fine, I said, my chest tight with anger. I'll take Buddy. He's coming with me. But as I stood there in the quiet, looking at the empty windows and the worn-out front porch, I realized something. It didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't in a long time. Even after Linda and her daughters were finally gone, the house didn't feel like a victory. It felt empty, hollow. I stood there in the living room, looking around at the mess they left behind, and it hit me hard. This wasn't the home I'd bought for my dad. It wasn't the quiet, peaceful place I'd hoped he could live out his days in. They'd ruined it. The place was trashed. Their junk was still everywhere. Furniture that wasn't mine, random clothes and shoes left behind like they couldn't even be bothered to clean up. The walls were scuffed up, the carpet stained with God knows what. And the kitchen? Don't even get me started. It was like they didn't give a damn about anything, as long as they got what they wanted out of it. I spent the next few days cleaning, trying to erase every trace of them. But no matter how much I scrubbed, no matter how many boxes of their leftover garbage I threw out, I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd taken something from me. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like this empty shell, full of memories I didn't want. I could almost hear their voices echoing in the rooms. Linda's snide remarks, Kate's whining, Alice's eye rolls. But what hurt the most was knowing my dad had spent his last years in this mess. That he'd lived here, feeling powerless, being pushed aside while they took over. I kept thinking about him sitting in that chair by the window, staring out like he wasn't even part of his own life anymore. I brought Buddy with me every time I went over to the house, hoping it would make things feel a little better. He'd sniff around, wagging his tail, but even he seemed uneasy. He'd whine sometimes, like he was looking for my dad, expecting him to be there in his usual spot, scratching behind his ears. I'd sit out on the back porch sometimes just to clear my head, but all I could think about was how different it all felt. The backyard, where we used to grill, talk, just be together, now felt like a graveyard of old memories. I could still picture my dad standing by the grill, flipping burgers with a beer in his hand, Buddy running circles around us like he didn't have a care in the world. But those days were long gone. After a few weeks, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep coming back to the house, trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. It wasn't home. Not for me, not for Buddy, and definitely not for my dad. I had to let it go, so I put the house up for sale. It was a hard decision. Part of me felt like I was giving up on the last piece of my dad, but I knew it was the right thing to do. The place had been tainted by too much ugliness, too much drama. I couldn't keep it. Not like this. The day I signed the papers with the realtor, I took one last walk through the house. Room by room, I tried to focus on the good memories, the times before Linda came along when the house had actually been a safe place for my dad. But even those memories felt distant, like they belonged to a different time, a different life. Before I left, I stood in the living room for a while, staring at the empty space where my dad's chair used to be. I felt this heaviness in my chest, a mix of sadness and anger that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything that had happened, everything I'd lost. My dad, Buddy's home, and any sense of normalcy. But as I walked out the door for the last time, I felt a strange sense of relief too. Like I was finally closing a chapter that needed to end. Linda and her daughters were gone. The house was behind me. And maybe now I could start to heal. Buddy hopped into the car, settling into the passenger seat like he knew we were done here. I glanced at him and smiled a little, scratching his head as I started the engine. "Guess it's just us now, Bud," I muttered. As we drove away, I didn't look back. I stood there, phone in hand, my head spinning. It wasn't just her words that got to me. It was the way she said them, like she was planning something. I had a bad feeling in my gut, but I didn't know just how bad it was going to get. After that phone call with Linda, I tried to put it behind me, hoping she'd come to her senses. I figured she'd cool off, realize she didn't have a leg to stand on, and move on with her life. But deep down, I knew better. Linda wasn't the type to let go of something she wanted, especially not something as big as the house. Sure enough, about a month later, I got served. She was suing me, claiming she had a right to the house. I wasn't surprised, but it still made my blood boil. Here I was grieving my dad, trying to pick up the pieces, and Linda was trying to take the one thing that was still tied to him. The house I bought to give him some peace after everything had fallen apart. I immediately called my lawyer, John, a guy I'd known since college. He didn't sugarcoat it for me. "Look, she doesn't have a case," he said. "You've got the deed. You've got proof you bought the place. She doesn't have a claim to it. But that doesn't mean she won't drag this out and make it ugly." Ugly. Yeah, that was exactly what it was going to be. I could feel it in my bones. The court hearings were a nightmare. Linda showed up dressed like she was going to some fancy dinner, all smiles and fake charm, like she was trying to win over the judge with her appearance alone. But I knew the truth, and I was ready. She claimed my father had promised her the house verbally, that it was his dying wish for her to live there with her daughters. There were no documents, no written agreements, just her word. She even tried to make it seem like I was the bad guy, like I was throwing her and her daughters out on the street with no compassion. It was disgusting. John handled most of the talking, but I couldn't sit there quietly the whole time. When Linda started talking about how much she'd invested in the house, how she'd made improvements and upgrades, I couldn't keep my mouth shut. "What improvements?" I snapped, louder than I intended. "You bought some cheap furniture and stuck up a few posters. Don't stand here and act like you rebuilt the place." The judge gave me a look like he was warning me to keep it together, but I couldn't help it. Listening to her lie like that, trying to paint me as the villain, made my skin crawl. John shot me a look too, one that said, "I got this," so I shut up and let him handle the rest. He laid out the facts, plain and simple. The house was mine. I bought it with my own money, and there was no proof that my dad had promised it to her. Linda tried to keep up her act, but as the evidence piled up, her confidence started to crack. She had nothing. No documents, no contracts, no receipts, nothing that could back up her ridiculous claims. It didn't take long for the judge to see through it all. He ruled in my favor, just like John had predicted. Linda and her daughters were given 2 weeks to pack their things and leave the house. 2 weeks. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? You'd think after losing in court, after being told in front of a judge that the house wasn't hers, Linda would pack up, leave quietly, and be done with it. But of course, nothing with her was ever that simple. After the judge ruled in my favor, I thought maybe, just maybe, things would calm down. I thought Linda and her daughters would take the 2 weeks, pack their stuff, and disappear from my life. But of course, that's not how it went. The first week came and went with no sign of them moving out. Every time I drove by the house, I'd see the same cars parked in the driveway, the same lights on at night. It was like they were daring me to do something about it. I called Linda a few days before the deadline, hoping to avoid any more drama. Maybe, just maybe, a calm conversation would get through to her. She picked up on the second ring. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice dripping with annoyance, like I was the one who had been out of line. "You know exactly what I want," I said, trying to stay calm. "You've got 2 days left. I expect you, and your daughter's out by then." Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe she'd hung up, but then I heard her sigh. "We're working on it," she said, her voice suddenly softer, almost sweet. "It's just difficult, you know, finding a place on such short notice. Can't you give us a little more time?" I clenched my fists so tight I could feel my nails digging into my palm. "You've had more than enough time," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "The court gave you 2 weeks. That's the deal." She didn't respond. I could hear her breathing on the other end, but nothing else. After a long pause, she finally said, "Fine." Then she hung up. I should have felt relieved, but something about the way she said "fine" made my stomach twist. I knew Linda well enough to know that she wasn't giving up that easily. 2 days later, I drove to the house, half expecting it to be empty, half expecting another fight. I pulled up in front, and my heart sank. Their cars were still there, parked in the driveway, like nothing had changed. I walked up to the door, knocked hard, and waited. Alice answered, looking annoyed to even see me standing there. "What do you want?" she said, crossing her arms like she owned the place. "What do I want?" I snapped. "I want you out." She rolled her eyes. "Mom's not here." "Then call her," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You've got 5 minutes to get her on the phone, or I'm calling the cops." Alice glared at me, but didn't argue. She pulled out her phone and started texting. Meanwhile, I walked through the house, my anger growing with every step. It was a mess, clothes thrown everywhere, dirty dishes piled up in the kitchen, the whole place smelling like stale perfume and takeout. It didn't even feel like my dad's home anymore. A few minutes later, Linda showed up. She walked in like she was coming back from a shopping trip, not a woman about to be thrown out of a house she didn't own. "What's the rush?" she said, flashing me a fake smile. "We're packing. It's just taking a little longer than expected." I'd had enough. "You've had your time," I said, my voice firm. "Now I'm done playing nice. If you're not out by the end of the day, I'm calling the police, and they'll handle it." "You think I'm bluffing? Try me." For a split second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Panic, maybe. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. She smirked, crossing her arms like she had some kind of upper hand. "Go ahead," she said, her tone cold. "Call the police. See what good that does you." That was it. I stormed out of the house, pulled out my phone, and dialed the number. I was done playing games. The cops showed up within the hour. Linda tried to act like she didn't know what was happening, all sweet and innocent, but the officer wasn't having it. I showed him the court order, and that was the end of it. She and her daughters were given no choice. They had to leave. I watched as they packed up their things, moving slowly, dragging out every second like they were still in control. But finally, after hours of waiting, they were gone. They piled into their cars, glaring at me one last time before driving off, and I stood there in front of the house, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders for the first time in what felt like forever. The house was mine again. I got the call about a week later. It was late at night. One of those moments when you know before you even pick up the phone that something's wrong. It was Linda, of course. Her voice was flat, emotionless, like she was talking about a broken appliance. "Not my father. He's been moved to hospice," she said, and for a second, I couldn't process it. It was like everything around me just froze. I knew it was coming, but hearing those words out loud, it hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. I didn't say much on the call. I don't even remember if I responded or if I just hung up. I grabbed my jacket, put Buddy in the car, and drove straight to the hospice without thinking. The whole drive felt surreal. My head was spinning with a million thoughts, none of them making any sense. When I got to the hospice, I saw Linda in the hallway, talking to a nurse. Alice and Kate were nowhere to be seen, probably off doing God knows what. Linda looked at me and gave me this weird, tight smile. "He's not in pain," she said, like she was trying to comfort me. But the way she said it, so cold, so detached, just made me want to punch a hole in the wall. I walked past her without a word and went straight to my dad's room. When I opened the door, my heart sank. There he was lying in that bed, hooked up to machines barely recognizable. His skin was pale, and he looked smaller than ever, like a shell of the man he used to be. But when he saw Buddy, something changed. His eyes lit up, just for a second, and he smiled. The same smile I hadn't seen since the last time we were together. Buddy jumped up onto the bed, resting his head gently on my dad's chest, like he knew exactly what was happening. My dad's hand trembled as he reached out to pet him, his fingers barely able to move. "Hey, Dad," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were full of emotion. I sat down next to the bed, watching as Buddy snuggled up closer to him. For a moment, it was like nothing had changed, like we were back at the house, sitting in the backyard with the grill going, just the three of us. We sat there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. My dad's breathing was shallow, each breath taking more effort than the last. I didn't want to believe this was it, but deep down I knew it was. I brought him to say goodbye. I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. "I know how much you love him." My dad's lips moved, but no sound came out. He was trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come. His eyes stayed locked on Buddy, though, and I knew exactly what he wanted to say. He didn't have to speak. We'd said everything we needed to already. I felt tears welling up, but I fought them back. I didn't want my dad to see me cry, not now. I needed to be strong for him, even though it felt like my entire world was crashing down. I held his hand, squeezing it gently, while Buddy stayed right there by his side. After a while, his breathing slowed. It became so quiet that I found myself holding my breath, just listening, waiting, and then it stopped. My dad was gone. For a moment, the room was completely still. No sound, no movement, just silence. Buddy looked up at me, like he understood what had just happened, and I lost it. The tears came, and I didn't care anymore. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing like a kid who just lost his dad, because that's exactly what I was. I stayed with him for a while after that, holding his hand, not ready to let go. Eventually I had to. The nurses came in, and Linda hovered in the doorway, watching but saying nothing. I took one last look at my dad, knowing it was the last time I'd see him. As I left the hospice with Buddy at my side, I realized something. Linda and her daughters may have taken over his house, his life, but in that final moment, it was just me, my dad, and Buddy. The way it should have been. After my dad passed, everything felt like a blur. The funeral was small, just close family and a few friends. Linda did most of the organizing, of course, like it was some kind of performance she needed to control. But honestly, I didn't care about the details. My mind wasn't on the flowers or the music. It was on my dad and the fact that he was really gone. Buddy stayed with me the whole time, as if he could sense I needed him more than ever. He'd sit by my feet during the service, his head resting on my shoes, quiet and still. It was almost like he was grieving too. I swear, in moments like that, dogs understand more than people give them credit for. At the reception, I kept to myself mostly, avoiding Linda and her daughters. I didn't have the energy to pretend everything was fine. Every time I looked at Linda, all I could think about was how much control she'd taken from my dad in those last years, how she and her daughters had turned his home into something unrecognizable. It made my blood boil, but I held it together. For my dad's sake, I bit my tongue and went through the motions, shaking hands, accepting condolences. Still, I couldn't ignore the way Linda looked at me that day, like she was already thinking about what came next, her eyes cold and calculating, even while she put on this show of grief. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured maybe that's just how she dealt with death. Emotionless, detached. But a couple of days after the funeral, the real Linda showed up. She called me out of the blue, her voice annoyingly cheerful for someone who'd just lost her husband. "We need to talk about the house," she said, like she was discussing the weather. I knew what was coming before she even said it. "The house?" I replied, try to keep my tone neutral. "Yeah," she continued. "Your father always said he wanted me to have the house if anything happened to him. It's only fair, considering I took care of him." Fair? The house wasn't even my dad's to give. I bought it, paid for it out of my own pocket. I thought I'd misheard her for a second. "Linda," I said slowly, "the house belongs to me. I bought it for my dad, so he'd have a place to live after Mom passed. It was never his to leave to anyone." She didn't miss a beat. I understand that, but we were married and I was his wife. Surely, you can understand that he wanted me and the girls to be taken care of. Taken care of? They'd been living rent-free in that house for years while my dad faded into the background. And now, she had the nerve to act like the house was hers? I'm sorry, but that's not happening, I said, trying to stay calm even though I could feel my pulse racing. You and the girls can stay for a bit while you figure things out. But you're not keeping the house. I thought that would be the end of it, that maybe she'd back down. But no, of course not. Linda wasn't the type to let something go easily. That's not acceptable, she snapped, her friendly tone gone in an instant. Your father promised me the house. He wanted us to stay here. You can't just kick us out. It took everything in me not to lose it right then. Linda, I said, my voice shaking now, this house is mine. You have 3 months. After that, you either start paying rent or you find somewhere else to live. Silence. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, but she didn't say anything. Then finally she spoke. We'll see about that, she said, her voice cold, before hanging up. I didn't wait for an argument. I just grabbed Buddy's leash, and he followed me out the door without a second thought. I didn't even look back. As I left, I could feel their eyes on me. Linda's cold, calculating stare, and Kate's smug expression, like they'd just won something. But it didn't matter. I wasn't about to let them push my dad around anymore. At least, not when it came to Buddy. I figured that would be the end of it, but deep down I knew things were only going to get worse. After I took Buddy, things between me and Linda's crew got icy. Real icy. I could feel the tension the moment I walked into the house on my weekend visits. It was like I didn't belong there anymore. Linda and her daughters would barely acknowledge me. And when they did, it was with these cold, dismissive looks like I was the intruder in their house. My dad? He seemed smaller every time I saw him. He'd sit in his chair, looking like a shadow of the man I used to know. I'd ask him how he was doing, but all I'd get were short, tired answers. I'm fine, son. Everything's okay. But I knew it wasn't. He was fading, and I didn't know how to stop it. What really pissed me off, though, was the way they treated him. Linda was always talking for him, making decisions like she was the one in charge. Need new furniture? Linda picked it out. Even the small stuff like what to watch on TV or what to have for dinner. It was all up to her and her daughters. And my dad? He just sat there, letting them take over like he didn't have a say in his own life anymore. One time, I came over to watch a football game with him, something we used to do all the time before Linda came into the picture. I walked in, expecting to see him with the game on, a beer in hand, but instead, they were watching some reality show, one of those terrible ones where everyone's screaming at each other over nonsense. My dad wasn't even watching, just sitting there staring off into space. Hey, Dad, I said, grabbing the remote. You want to catch the game? Before he could answer, Kate, who was sprawled out on the couch like she owned the place, snatched the remote back. We're watching this, she said flatly, not even looking at me. I shot a look at my dad, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But he didn't. He just looked at the floor like he was embarrassed. Come on, I said, trying to keep calm. It's just a game. Dad and I used to watch together every Sunday. Linda, who had been in the kitchen, walked in at that moment. Oh, let them watch what they want, she said, all sweet and patronizing. Your father doesn't mind. I clenched my jaw, holding back the anger that was bubbling up inside me. Doesn't mind? I snapped. Or doesn't have a choice? That's when my dad finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. It's okay, son. We can watch the game another time. I couldn't believe it. He was just giving up again. I felt like I was losing him, bit by bit, every time I came over. It wasn't just the house they were taking from him. It was him. His voice, his choices, his life. They were stripping him of everything, and he didn't even have the strength to fight back. So, I stopped going over as much. It hurt too much to see him like that, and I felt helpless, like there was nothing I could do to stop what was happening. I still brought Buddy over sometimes because I knew that, deep down, my dad missed him. Buddy would wag his tail and nuzzle up to him, and for a few minutes, it felt like things were normal again. But even then, Linda and her daughters would give me dirty looks, whispering under their breath, as if we were intruding on their perfect little setup. Every time, it felt like they were just waiting for the day my dad wouldn't even recognize Buddy anymore. And I started wondering, maybe that day was closer than I thought. The last time I brought Buddy over, I knew something was really wrong. My dad's health had been declining for a while. His face was thinner, his voice weaker, and he moved slower than ever. But that day when I walked in with Buddy by my side, it felt different. Like I was visiting a stranger, not my father. Linda and her daughters didn't even pretend to be polite anymore. Kate barely glanced up from her phone when we walked in, and Alice just gave me a tight-lipped smirk, like she was annoyed we were even there. Linda was in the kitchen as usual, talking on the phone, but I could hear her making plans for something that clearly had nothing to do with my dad's needs. I didn't bother with small talk. I just walked straight into the living room where my dad was sitting in his usual spot, staring out the window. He didn't even notice me at first, not until Buddy ran up to him and nudged his leg. "Hey, Dad," I said quietly, not wanting to startle him. He blinked a few times before turning his head toward me, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, son," he said, reaching down to pat Buddy on the head. It was the first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks, maybe months. We sat there for a while, not talking much. I think we both knew this wasn't a day for conversations. My dad was tired, more tired than I'd ever seen him. He tried to talk a few times, but his voice kept cracking like it hurt just to speak. So I didn't push him. I just sat there with Buddy at his feet, and we watched the sunset through the window like we used to do before everything went to hell. After a while, he finally spoke. I'm not going to be around much longer, am I?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I swallowed hard, trying to hold back the lump in my throat. "Don't talk like that, Dad," I said, even though we both knew it was the truth. He'd been in and out of doctors' offices, but no one ever said it out loud. They didn't have to. We knew. He nodded slowly, like he accepted it, like he'd made peace with it already. But then he looked down at Buddy, who had his head resting on my dad's lap, and his eyes started to well up with tears. "Take care of him, will you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I felt my chest tighten, my heart breaking in ways I didn't think it still could. "Of course I will," I promised, my voice shaky. "You know I will, Dad." We sat there in silence for a long time after that. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of Linda's voice in the kitchen, talking about something that didn't matter. My dad didn't say anything more, but he didn't need to. His hand stayed on Buddy's head, stroking his fur, and I could see it in his eyes. He was saying goodbye, not just to Buddy, but to everything. To me, to the life he used to have. When it was time to leave, I didn't want to go. Something told me this was the last time I'd see him like this, awake, aware, still my dad. But I couldn't stay. Not with Linda and her daughters hovering around, acting like we didn't belong there. So I stood up, gave my dad a long hug, and promised I'd come back soon. "Bring Buddy," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I will," I told him, trying to keep it together. But deep down, I knew the next time I came, things would be different. I just didn't know how much. As I left, I glanced back one last time. My dad was sitting there with Buddy by his side, looking so small, so fragile. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I couldn't protect him anymore.